with just 44 days to go till we have to make our final decision. And it's said to be the most important vote that most of us will cast in our lifetimes. So tonight, with the aid of our distinguished panel here, we're going to help you make up your minds about whether you want to remain in the European Union or whether you want to leave the EU. Now, before I introduce our guests, I just want to say a few words of thanks. First of all, to the organisers of the event, that's the Ipswich Suffolk Business Club, the Suffolk Institute of Directors, and the East Anglian Society of Chartered Accountants. And second, to our sponsors, Goatley Solicitors, and to Dance East for providing this wonderful venue free of charge. Now, this evening's question time will be of the style of the BBC's question time. Questions have been chosen from the audience. They were submitted in advance, and we hope to cover a range of issues that are pertinent to you as a business audience. I may occasionally ask for a show of hands on a particular point. Now, you have already voted, thank you for that, to give us an idea of what your thoughts are at this stage, and I can now reveal that in that vote, 40% were in favour of remaining in the EU, 36% were in favour of leaving, and 24% were undecided. So there's all to play for our panel. So let's crack on with the debate now, and I will introduce our panel. On the left here we have Lord Deben in the Remain camp. The Right Honourable John Gummer was the Conservative MP for Suffolk Coastal until 2010. He served for 16 years as a British minister in the governments of Margaret Thatcher and John Major, as Employment Minister, Paymaster General, Minister for London, Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, before moving in 1992 to the Department of the Environment. In 1997, he returned to his business roots, founding Sancroft to advise companies on their corporate responsibility strategy. Lord Deben is also chairman of the UK's Independent Committee on Climate Change, the recycling company Valpak Limited, and the Association of Professional Financial Advisors. So welcome, Lord Deben. Ian Duncan Smith is on the Leave campaign, known to all of us as IDS. As part of the Scots Guards, Ian Duncan Smith saw active service in Northern Ireland and Rhodesia. He later worked for GEC Marconi. He was elected MP for Chingford in 1992 and was Shadow Secretary of State for Social Security and Shadow Defence Secretary before being elected as party leader in 2001. After stepping down in 2003, he set up the Centre for Social Justice, an independent think tank committed to tackling poverty and social breakdown. IDS was appointed Secretary of State for Work and Pensions by David Cameron, but resigned in March this year in protest at the government's cuts to disability benefits. Now, Mr. Duncan Smith has had to say that he has to leave promptly at 7:30, so please do excuse him if the debate is carrying on and he has to exit stage right, so that he has to get back for a vote. It's the Whip's office. You don't disobey the Whip's office. Jonathan Knight is on the Remain camp. Jonathan Knight is founder and chief executive of Osozim, a Cambridge-based technology company that uses artificial intelligence to model human behaviour and provides training and assessment solutions for companies and non-profit organisations. It's a young post-startup company but has clients throughout the world, such as Cisco, BNP Paribas, Deloitte, the World Economic Forum and the RSPCA. Jonathan is a Cambridge graduate and has previous careers in investment banking and strategy consulting before becoming a technology entrepreneur in 2004. And last but not least, Tim Martin for the Leave campaign. Tim Martin is founder and chairman of JD Wetherspoon plc, a FTSE 250 company. The company was floated on the stock exchange in 1992 with 44 pubs. In 1979, Tim, aged just 24, opened his first pub in Muswell Hill, North London. And apparently the Wetherspoon name comes from one of your teachers in New Zealand.
True.
Who didn't think you had the capability to do what you have done. So it's wonderful.
He couldn't control the class. That's the rumour.
But now you have 941 pubs operating in the UK and Ireland. So welcome to all of you. And let's get going with the debate. Our first question is from Andrew Macmillan.
Rather predictable, I'm afraid. This is about business. If we vote to leave the EU, how will business in the UK be affected? And specifically, which sectors do you see benefiting and which will be most at risk?
Lord Deben.
Well, first of all, of course, if we voted to leave the EU, we'd have to tell the EU we're leaving, and we'd have 2 years to negotiate terms. And, of course, as that time went on, it would get tougher and tougher. And if we didn't negotiate terms, then we would go to the WTO fallout position, which is the lowest tariffs that the EU has would be against us. Businesses would be, all of them, I don't think there are ones that would benefit, because the single market enables us to sell our goods without any tariffs at all. There's no way in which the European Union would accept that unless we were prepared to pay our way, unless we were prepared to have free movement of labour, unless we were prepared to have all the things that the Brexit supporters believe to be disadvantages, but of course without a vote. That's the difference. So the likelihood is that we wouldn't get free trade. We would be paying major tariffs, for example, for service industries, which Ipswich is very dependent. If you think of AXA and other companies in Ipswich, there'd be a tariff of between 5 and 15%, which would be on the bills. So when people came to say, where should their investment be, it wouldn't be in Ipswich. It would be in those parts of the company which are in the rest of Europe. I was talking the other day with someone who's a senior partner of a major solicitors. They are actually training 400 of their staff so that they can operate from Ireland, because Brexit would mean that they couldn't have the same access that you have now. The Canadians don't have it. Nobody who's got a deal with the European Union has it.
Lord Deben, I'm going to put your points to Mr. Duncan Smith, because isn't he right that you're not going to get something for nothing?
The one thing I do know about all of this is nobody absolutely knows the future. The one thing I think about the Remain camp is they've had endless attempts to try and prophesy the future over the next 15 years. Just recently there was a report by the Treasury that suddenly told us that they could forecast that there would be a change or a reduction in growth, both sides would be growing, whether you leave or stay, of 0.6% every year. Actually, it's a joke to be able to think you can forecast that far, because last year I was in the government when we did the business statement at the end of the year on expenditure, and they said that it was £27 billion surplus in taxation during 1920, which they forecast. By January, about 8 weeks later, that had gone to nothing, and there was no surplus in taxation. So if you can't forecast 2 months, you can't forecast 15 years. So, well, I want to come to this point now. So the question directly asked was what would benefit and what would not. My general view is that we would benefit overall over the period of time for the very simple reason that, first of all, I believe it is in the interest of the European Union to ensure that they do a reasonable deal with us, because bear in mind that the European Union itself in goods alone, you don't have to look in the streets and see how many cars from Germany, etc., exported. They have a trade surplus with us, a massive trade surplus with the UK. France has a trade surplus in farm stuff, cheeses and various other elements that they sell, and Spain has a trade surplus with us in goods. So some of the main countries in Europe trade more with us than we do with them in goods. The problem for the services side is that the single market has never existed properly for the service sector. In 30 years, we have had promise after promise that they would resolve that. They don't. You can't, if you're an insurance company, deal straight into Germany from the UK. It's not happening. It's not allowed. That has been a huge restriction on the services sector. I think the service sector, which is now in danger of being over-regulated from Brussels, more and more of those coming, hopefully to shut down London, I think the reality is the service sector will benefit dramatically from being free of those regulations, as will small businesses, 90% who don't deal in Europe at all.
We're going to talk a bit more about small businesses in a moment. Can I just have a yes or no answer? Do you agree with your colleague, Michael Gove, that we shouldn't be in the single market if we had Brexit?
I think we can easily trade outside it, but I also believe that it will be in the interest of the European Union to ensure that they want to have a decent deal with us. After all, if you are Germany selling your cars to the UK, do you want to be the Chancellor of Germany going to BMW saying, I tell you what, we're going to try and punish the UK by having no deal with them? I don't think so somehow. That's not going to happen.
Tim wants to come in here. Tim.
Just a brief point. I think it's very important to stand back and look at the big picture. And the big picture is that democratic countries throughout the world, even if they haven't been democracies before, take Japan, take Singapore, New Zealand and Australia have, North America versus South. Democracy is what creates prosperity. The North America has been a fantastically successful country, and it's very democratic. South America has had tremendous problems with a lack of democracy and has consequently had tremendous economic problems. The problem with the EU is it's not just a common market. I think everyone here would be happy if it was. It's gradually taking democratic powers away. European commissioners who frame the laws are not elected, and we can't sack them. The European Court is supreme in decided law in this country, and there's 51 MEPs, I think it is, out of 753. They can't even initiate laws. We're gradually losing democracy, and that has far more bearing on our future than talking about specific treaties.
So you think this is all about sovereignty rather than actual trade? You'd like to
I
stay
don't
in
like the
single
word sovereignty because I think of 21 shillings or the Queen. What I talk about is democracy, and that, as everyone here knows, is the most important factor.
Yeah.
Jonathan Knight, is that the most important factor for you?
Well, Susie, I hope we'll have a chance to discuss democracy and sovereignty in a bit more detail, because I think it's a totally false argument, and I'm happy to explain why, but it goes a long way from where the question was. So slightly closer to the question was Ian Duncan Smith's comment about this famous argument that because Germany sells lots of BMWs, somehow the EU is going to lie down sort of flat and give us any trade agreement that we want. We have to realise there would be 27 other countries in the EU. There are only 2 countries, Germany and Netherlands, that have any substantial deficit with the UK. So, as he will know so well, I'm sure, it's not necessarily easy to get support from everyone. So I'm not sure that trade agreement argument is valid. But going actually more specifically to the question, you asked about sectors. I can speak best for my sector, which is technology and the other companies that we work with around Cambridge, so biotech, financial tech, etc. I know that in the short term, they will suffer, we will suffer, probably for different reasons from the ones you expect. Not necessarily the issue around trade agreements. Yes, I'm sure they will hurt us. I'm sure we'll still be able to trade, but the bureaucracy involved in trading to the EU and all the 53 other countries that the EU has agreements with will be more than a nuisance. But we depend heavily on skilled talent that is easy to get from elsewhere in Europe. And I know it's probably a very unpopular thing to say, but that is really important if you're a growing technology company, a company of the future for this country. So short term, we will suffer. Medium term, therefore, professional services.
We can still get talent from outside the EU and from within. We're not talking about banning immigration.
Why do we restrict ourselves only to the EU?
So what? So people talking about
why not software engineers from India, for God's sake? I don't see why it suddenly has to be from the European Union.
So they say, well, we can have this great point system for immigration. Well, for anyone running a small business, we'll know that that is another bit of paperwork, another bit of bureaucracy, which we don't want.
We are actually going to talk more on this issue about migrant workers and getting people and the skill base. So we're going to move on.
Can I just ask a very fundamental question? Of course we can't see the future. But that doesn't mean to say that you suddenly go in any direction because it doesn't matter. What you have to say to yourself is the European Union has not concluded a treaty with anybody else which would have the same advantages to us as being part of that. And therefore, when every major international finance advisor, when the CBI, when those people who are really
wanted us to join the euro,
when they
look, I've not interrupted other people. When they tell us that
this
would be extremely damaging, it seems to me that to take the general statements of Ian Duncan Smith and others like him is an extremely dangerous thing. That's not fear, that is just the facts. The European Union has never offered to anybody the deal that we have within the European Union and from which our businesses right across the board benefit.
I want to hear from Andrew McMillan. If Andrew can have the microphone back again. Andrew, what do you think about what you've heard? And are you happy to say what type of business you're in?
Yes, well, two businesses, financial services and hospitality. But you see, the problem with this, all of this is, we know roughly what's happening in the EU. We've been a member of the EU for a long, long time. Is it radically going to change? It might do, but I'm sorry, IDS, to pick up on two things you said, but I don't believe that just because we've left and we've got a trade, or other countries got a trade surplus, and lots of talk is about cars, BMWs and Mercedes, surely as a global market player, they will look for somewhere else, unless Germany wants what we've got to sell. And the thing that worries me is the 40% of our exports that go to Europe, what's going to happen to those? Because that's the real issue, not the trade surplus, and that's going to make them want to trade with us.
Well, can I just answer that question then? The United States does not have a trade deal with the European Union, but its exports to the European Union have grown faster than the UK's in the last 30 years. It is a fallacy to believe that somehow this idea of this unbelievably bureaucratic and regulated thing that we call the single market, which it is not, is somehow directly and massively beneficial to the UK. Our share of trade to the European Union has been falling over the last 15 years. And one other point I want to make.
But it hasn't fallen
very
much.
It meets this really important point. British business, we hear a lot about the idea that somehow they're wholly dependent on the European Union for their trade. You know, the reality is, if you look at where the British businesses across the board have been investing their money, they have been stripping money out of the European Union. It is now negative investment, and they've been putting it into a place we don't have a trade deal called the United States, where we are rising in our exports, and we run a trade comparison. We do not have a deficit.
47% of our exports.
No, it's 44%. Includes
which has gone from about 55%
includes a lot of rebadge trade, which goes into Europe and out as exports to other countries. The reality is that we can trade with the rest of the world without trade deals. We trade very happily with the rest of the world without trade deals, and we mostly are profitable in every single country we trade with.
I'm just going to move on to a supplementary question in this area, because I know a lot of you are SMEs, and I'd like to get a question from Steve Magnall.
Gentlemen, can you hear me? Whatever happens, I think the challenge will be around regulation and the costs associated with this, especially for SMEs. I run an SME and struggle big time with the regulations. How will we be able to ensure, whatever the outcome, we can have more say and reduce this burden?
Jonathan Knight.
I'd say, as someone running an SME, I've encountered no paperwork bureaucracy that is EU-driven. The main bureaucracy I've encountered in the last year or so has been driven by Whitehall, and particularly the sort of pensions legislation, a policy which I agree with, but actually was very poorly implemented by the Secretary of State, and has created a burden for small and medium-sized businesses. On the other hand, it's a hell of a lot easier to deal with the EU and South Korea and other countries that are tied into EU agreements than it is for us to export to countries like India. So to me, this bureaucracy argument is a false one, because I only see it coming from Whitehall. I don't see it at the moment coming from Brussels.
Tim Martin, would it actually change, because a lot of these regulations would probably have to stay in place, wouldn't they?
Well, the main thing about not being in the EU is that regulations would emerge from the UK. And in the UK, you can go and see your MP, you can campaign in the press.
You can go and see your MEP, though, can't you?
The main thing about even MEPs believe it's very, very difficult for them to change the law. As I said earlier, they can't frame the laws. The laws are framed by EU commissioners. But democracy means that you can go and see an MP, and I've done this myself. I've seen Ben Bradshaw in Exeter, where I live, and I've made various points, and I have occasionally been able to effect a change in the law. If it's the EU, it's far too remote. Read what the Electoral Reform Commission says. It's got a big democratic deficit. And the problem is, it's more certain and more predictable when you elect a parliament of MPs who make the laws, rather than laws emerging from Brussels through an undemocratic system.
Let's go back to Lord Deben, because there's no doubt that a lot of small and medium-sized businesses do feel the strain of these regulations. What can be done?
Well, I think, first of all, that my colleague is right. I mean, I chair the Association of Professional Financial Advisors. Ian Duncan Smith said all the financial pressures from the European Union, they're not from the European Union. They are almost entirely from Britain. We have decided on those. Indeed, the MiFID arrangements that the European Union is proposing are much lighter than the ones that the British have been. So what have the British done? What have we done? We've said we're going to add ours to anything the European Union does. So first of all, do make sure that the regulations you're complaining about are in fact European ones. I've usually found if you ask the question directly, you discover that they are British ones. It's perfectly possible to influence the European Union because they've got a better way of doing regulations. It's true that the Commission presents them, but they present them publicly, so you can argue them. The trouble with the British system is we do it privately and then we deliver it to Parliament long after the decisions are made.
Apparently, we were on the winning side of our negotiations on EU Council and Euro Parliament regulations 86% of the time last year. So, I mean, we do have influence, don't we?
Who actually produced that little note?
That little statistic.
Reality check.
Yeah, okay. Well, the reality check tends on whether or not it comes to a vote. 74 votes in the last 10 years have been lost to the UK government. I happen to know, having been in government, most areas are not brought to a vote for fear of losing and having bad publicity. Yeah. The reality is, very simply, and this comes from the House of Commons Library, it comes from almost every economist that you want to name, over 60% of the laws and regulations are now started in Brussels. They are made in Brussels. And they're made by the European Commission, who initiates. We don't have any power to initiate. And then you have a thing which I argued against, by the way, at the Maastricht Treaty, called qualified majority voting, which is massively extended to most of the areas that we are involved in. And that means that if we disagree and we cannot get a majority, then that regulation, that law becomes law, and we have to implement it here. So it doesn't matter whatever else the individual experiences of people are.
Bad laws? Are there laws that would have to be got rid of?
Well, here's the point I want to make. This is exactly the point that's just been made. The reality is that if you have in the UK a government elected and you think that that government has been too harsh on small business, it's put too many regulations in, you have an opportunity to get rid of it on the basis that you want them to have less regulation and to reduce that regulation. You can debate that with them. But when a very large, significant amount of that regulation actually starts beyond the government, you have no capacity to be able to change that. And that is the point that I make. The reality is very simple, it's factual. The cost element of that to UK business is seen as around £50 billion in extra regulated cost. This is from government figures and published about 2 years ago.
Very quickly.
So very high cost, but no ability to change it.
That's the point. Tim made one very revealing comment, which is that he could change law, change regulation. The question was about small and medium-sized business. I don't think any small and medium-sized business can change regulation. So that is the luxury of running a very large company. But most of us don't have that.
But I've changed laws in the European Union by putting pressure. I have to say, I'd negotiated in the European Union for 16 years. We never lost a single vote or argument that mattered to Britain, because we are very powerful in the European Union, and most of these regulations enable us to sell throughout the European Union. That's why Mrs. Thatcher was in favour of them. That's why she supported the single market, because she knew you had to have regulations across the European Union if you're going to sell.
I want to go back to Steve Magnol so we can move on. I just want, Steve, can you tell us specifically what the regulations are that are such a pain for you?
I export beer, by the way. I also sell it in the UK, but ours is about...
Buy it.
Well done, Tim. We'll see you after.
I'll have your vote.
Ours is about changing laws. So, for example, we're just exporting to Austria. We have been exporting for years to Austria, and suddenly the rules have just changed. That's not come from the UK. sorry, it's come from somebody in the EU or it's come from Austria. I've now got to rewrite a load of labels on a load of beer products to go back in.
But
I don't do financial services, I do manufacturing.
Yeah.
But you'll
Can I
still
just
want to
come-
do that export if we leave the EU, and you'll still be subject to the same regulation, but with
can I-
less of
well,
a say
It
in
would
the
be
regulation.
exactly the same. It
Yeah,
wouldn't change.
But he won't have to
Very,
impose it
very-
here in the UK, and that's the main point that we
Tim
make.
Martin
It
wants to
becomes
make
free to
one
him.
very
A
point, and then
very
move on.
quick point for you. We sell more wine in British pubs than any other managed pub company. We buy our wine from Africa, South America, Australia, New Zealand, virtually none from the EU. I've consistently said to our guys, you must be missing a trick here. It's far closer, and they're big makers of wine. And so where is this barrier to international trade? We haven't gone out of our way to exclude the EU. It so happens that we can buy things more efficiently at higher quality, which have to travel further from abroad.
Okay,
So-
I'm going to move on to the next question, which is, we have touched on. It's from Rachel Jackson.
Good evening. We have touched upon this, but what I'd like to know is if we leave the EU, how will this affect migrant workers and their freedom to work anywhere within the EU without restriction?
Ian Duncan-Smith, aren't we dependent on migrant workers?
Well, actually, I don't think we are. I think the reality is that the big problem that we face in the European Union is not having to be able to shut our doors. It's not migration, it's uncontrolled migration. That is to say, with members of the European Union, we are not at liberty at any stage to say somebody cannot come in. Even if they have a criminal record, we're not at liberty unless we're able to demonstrate categorically that that individual poses a direct and immediate threat to the United Kingdom or to the citizens of the United Kingdom. And this has led to all sorts of problems. But the biggest problem it faces is that, look, we want to be able to bring people in who have the skills that are necessary where those shortages exist in the UK. I was talking earlier on about shortages of software engineers, but we shouldn't necessarily just have to be able to say from within the EU. What about people from the Indian subcontinent, highly skilled, highly trained, want to be able to bring those in. But what we have to do is, because of this unbalance, we have to shut down hugely on those coming in from outside the European Union, but we have an open border with the European Union. I don't think that any country worth its salt should have to have that ability to control your borders taken away from you. So a kind of point system, a system that we would have that would regulate those coming in. And they can come in without any job. They can come in to look for work or to, at this particular point, claim benefits if they wish. That's the position. It's not the benefits, it's the issue. It's the numbers coming in. And the way they've lowered the cost of labour in many, many areas, causing huge problems with housing. One of the big areas we don't forget about is the massive demand for housing now, hugely by all of the reports, shows us, is massively driven by migration coming in from the European Union. This is a big problem for people on low incomes, and we should think about them a little bit while we have these debates as well.
Lord Deben, the infrastructure problem is a real issue, isn't it?
Well, first of all, the fact of the matter is that we can allow people, if we want them, from any part of the world. We do have a common system in the European Union, and I want my children and my grandchildren to be able to go throughout Europe and get jobs there, like 2 million British people who are in the rest of the European Union. So if we withdrew from the European Union, then first of all, that would not be available to our people, and we would have to accept that.
But if you
That depends on negotiation.
Yeah, exactly right.
What about the
Can I just say, my family,
respect-
I have a large chunk of my family living in Italy. They went out there before we joined the European
Okay,
Union without any problems whatsoever. So this is a
continue.
total red herring, this idea that suddenly you
Can we
wouldn't be able
just
to
talk
go to
about
the
the
European
strain on
Union.
resources?
I wish, frankly, you know, it would be nice to be able to finish a sentence. The point I just want to make is this.
This red herring.
I just want to make the point that we have this common ability to move throughout the European Union, and that does give an opportunity to all of us. If we didn't have it, it wouldn't depend on the negotiations, because we know that only if you are prepared to have everybody who is at present able to come in for the rest of the European Union, would we be able to go there? Are you really suggesting we could negotiate a situation in which British people could actually live and work in the European Union without any let or hindrance, but we could say that nobody from the European Union could come in unless we agreed to them? Of course that's not a possible negotiation. And please, we have got to talk about what is likely. I'd like to live in a world where everything was for the best. We live in a real world, and in the real world, if you want to have a common arrangement, it has to be common on both sides.
I'd like to ask the audience, for a show of hands, how many of you either employ or work with people from the EU? That's quite a lot, isn't it? And two over here as well. And Jonathan, I know you wanted to pick up on Lord Eben's point there.
Ian Duncan Smith made a mistake of mentioning software engineers, which I know a little bit about. So whether you're talking about software or technology or indeed financial services, the reality is that there are three major sort of axes in the world, and in terms of where activity is going on. And if you're trying to recruit in the technology industry, and I think probably the same is true in financial services, trying to recruit someone from the US, from North America, for example, is really tough because the magnitude of that market is so huge. The same is true to a slightly lesser extent, but still quite strongly in Asia, around Singapore and India. So for us to grow, the best source of talent is amongst the highly educated workforce, people in the rest of Europe, who are attracted at the moment to this country by the entrepreneurialism, by the tax rates, etc. We're a great centre of technology, a great centre for the future. But I know, not just from our business, but other businesses, we could just pack up our bags overnight and move to Dublin or to other parts of the EU. And I know there are plenty of companies that will do that, partially because
there's nothing to say that we would stop outside the EU. If Ian was the Prime Minister, which I'm going to vote for, by the way, then I said to him, look, we're short of software engineers, Ian. I've just been over in Paris playing rugby for the weekend, and I met some brilliant ones over there. Can we please allow software engineers in from Europe? The answer would be...
Control, yes, if you need them.
So he's changed his mind.
Can I just get... But this is the point about the argument. What the other side keeps on trying to do is the idea that somehow we're going to shut up borders immediately and stop anyone coming in. That's simply not the case. Every country outside the European Union has a system called controlled migration. Australia has a point system. The United States have a system. We manage... Listen, I used to be involved in a publishing company, which I was on the board of, and we hired people in the United States. We brought them over. They went the other way as well. I put people into the United States. We did it without too much problem.
But again,
it was fine.
This is the
My
big
point I want to make, though...
If you're a small
no,
or
it's really
medium-sized
important.
business,
No, it's
you
really
can't
important.
go through
The idea you're going to up
bureaucracy and
sticks and go to
paperwork to do
Ireland,
that.
fine, that's a decision you make. But the reality is, I believe that we want the skills that we need, what we don't need. And here's the point. The vast majority of people that come from the European Union into the UK under the open borders scheme are taking low-skilled and unskilled work. This is a red herring to believe that suddenly people with real skills and real needs in the UK would be banned from that. Quite the contrary. We want to control the level of migration. We don't end it, and that's the key
all
point
our 2
by
million
British
people
government.
can come home, can they?
No.
Our 2 million people...
Why?
Simply
Who's going to tell them
because
to come home?
if you do not have a common border in which people can move backwards and forwards, then there will be restrictions.
I came here
on the
from
other
Ireland
side.
when I was 19.
Of course
So
there will
rubbish.
be.
I mean, honestly, the idea that everyone's going to be
saying-
kicked out and sent home is a
If I
complete
may say
idiotic
something,
idea.
it's no good saying they won't be.
These are the little Englanders over here, I have to tell you, not over
Hear
here.
what Rachel has to say on this issue.
Thank you very much. Very lively discussion. My family are actually German. I worked in Germany for 2 years. I'd hate the idea that we could not work within the EU. But what does concern me is, and Ian Duncan Smith alluded to this, that you can't operate a country without borders and without security. Safety and security is incredibly important, and I don't believe, as we've been discussing, that we would just shut up shop and not allow anybody in. I don't think that would be the case, and nobody can really tell. We're hearing a lot of discussion that we would be in a position where...
The best example is Ireland, where before the EU, the Irish were allowed to come and work here,
Absolutely.
and hundreds of thousands did, and we were allowed to go and work there, and that still applies today. That's not to say that we couldn't say to France, if we wanted the government to do it, that the French can come and work here in the way they do now. Maybe we would say that. I'd probably take a slightly more liberal
But
line.
It'd be nice to get a commitment then from Ian Duncan Smith if he's in
Well,
that
he can
position.
give a
No,
commitment.
I can be very clear about this. Controlled migration means you operate your migration system to the benefit of those who work in the UK and who need the jobs.
For the
I'm
benefit
simply
of
saying the
big
vast,
business
no, but,
that
no,
can
I'm sorry,
afford
the
the
vast
thing.
majority of people that have entered from the European Union, and by the way, we were told it would only be a few thousand. Hundreds of thousands have come in, most of those for low-skilled jobs. I was Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. The job centres were full of people who could do those jobs. Why do you need to bring people in
Why
for that?
didn't you do a
That's
bit
the kind
more
of
when
control
you were
that I'd be
Secretary of
after.
State?
It's
Wow.
quite
Sort
reasonable
out
to
the
ask for
welfare.
that.
Okay. We're going to move on to a related question again. This is from Kira Scallon.
Good evening. How do you envisage that a Brexit would impact the creative industries and our nation's cultural funding and output, given that currently culture contributes so positively to the UK's global standing and GDP, and particularly cultural tourism in this region?
And we want to open this up also to the science and technology sectors, because again, very reliant on funding, gets a lot of funding from the EU, like the creative industries. Jonathan Knight.
Well, of course, two quite different issues around EU funding for research in the arts and the movement of creative talent. As you can guess, I don't like immigration controls. So I know that organisations I work with, particularly business schools, universities, they have a really tough time. They've had a really tough time in the last 2 or 3 years, thanks to the restrictions that have been put in place on people from outside the EU. And I don't believe that those are going to go away if we leave the EU. If anything, they'll just get steadily worse, which just means there's another group of people that can't come here and perform, can't study, or sort of really enrich the cultural sectors and the R&D sector.
Isn't this about attracting the best people? And if you make it difficult in those creative industries, in the science and technology sectors, you're not going to have that collaboration that we now have.
Can I just make a point on this one? The reason why the government had to be very tight on people outside the European Union was because migration with the European Union has been running out of control, mostly at the low-skilled, unskilled end of the market. If we control our border so that we go for skills that we need, we'll be able to be much better about bringing in people from outside the European Union whose skills we need without so much restriction. There is a balance here. If you have uncontrolled migration with the European Union, you have to have much tighter control outside. I want to have a proper border control system that brings the talents that are necessary to the UK, that businesses can prove they need, and we bring them in. And can I make one point in answer to this question? Because it was about culture. Honestly, I don't know what the European Union adds to culture. Shakespeare wasn't a member of the European Union. People come here to Britain because our cultural heritage is fantastic. Poets, artists, authors, you name it, we've got it. That's why they come here. They don't come saying, I love the European Union for its cultural input. It's almost Soviet-style concepts, that I'm afraid, and I give that up.
No, it doesn't.
We give the funding. British net
EU
contributors to the European Union.
It's money that goes out,
Exactly.
and we pay, and
Exactly
it comes
right.
back in with strings attached. So we can fund culture and
Completely.
do fund culture within
Many
within
times
the
over.
country. And we'll have half the money left over. So
Lord Dibble,
First of all the people who are most concerned about that, the universities, the cultural organisations, are almost without exception, particularly our own local university college here, as well as Cambridge, are passionately against Brexit. Are they very clear that it's very important to have the common open arrangements that we have? And I must say, I think that culture is not just about Britain, but the whole of Europe. I'm proud about European culture.
Yeah, but it wasn't
And
started by the European Union.
And if I may say so, talk about Little England.
Which painting was
The
done by the
fact of the
European
matter
Union?
is, we are very close to each other. If we can't learn to work and live together in the European
Well, we
Union,
can.
this way,
We
how
all agree
the
with that.
blazes are we going to work with people further
sorry.
away
We agree
in a
with that.
world
With
which is
respect.
getting smaller and
With
smaller?
respect, John.
So all I say to you is, everybody who is in the business of culture, almost without exception, says, please, please don't leave the European Union, because this is what has enabled us to enrich not just British culture, but European culture as a
But
whole.
Ian Duncan
And
Smith
that
is
is
saying-
worthwhile.
It's
That's
because
something
it's
we should
funded
stand
by
up
the-
for.
Excuse me,
our
Ian Duncan
money
Smith
through
is
the
saying
EU.
that he wants to open it up to everybody,
Yeah,
and at the
you know,
moment
my
it's
point
very
is-
narrowly reliant on
We
EU.
we do open it up to everybody now.
Yeah.
I have to say, I've been the Minister for Work Permits, and I do know a bit about it. I just have to say, it is true that anybody of great worth to our culture, wherever they come from, can come to Britain in a way that you can't go to the United States. We do open it up. But the trouble is, the Brexit people want it both ways. They want to tell people that they'll keep everybody out because people are afraid
we
of
don't
immigration.
say that.
And now they
We
want to
don't
tell
say
us they'll
that.
bring everybody
Can I-
in.
can I
You
be very
really
clear?
can't have it both ways.
Can we just be very clear about this? Instead of having John Gummer tell us what we said, can I just say it? What I want is controlled migration to the UK, which will allow us to be more balanced to those outside the European Union as well as inside the
Can I
European
just
Union.
clarify, do you want visas? Do you want put a point
I
system
have
like
a, you know,
Australia?
whether it's a point system or whatever, the truth is what we want is control so that we're allowed to see that the skills that we need, whether they be from India or the United States or whether they be from Poland, have equal treatment in that regard. And the point
So
I'm
we will
simply
have
making,
visas.
hang
So
on,
we will
the
have
reason
visas.
why you
So
can't,
we will have visas.
the reason why you cannot have that control right now, and you have to be tighter for those outside the European Union, is because the scale of migration from open borders with the European Union is so great that you have to tighten
Can I
up
just-
on the other
can I
bit to
just
keep
ask
overall migration
Kira,
down.
if there
That
were
is the
Can
problem.
I just ask Kira, if there were visas put in place or a point system, would it have a negative impact, in your view, on the creative industries?
Yes, I believe it would. And I'm not quite sure what question the panel were answering, but it wasn't the one I asked. Actually, it would make a difference because when you're in an arts organisation that engages in cultural collaboration and cooperation, not just with Europe, but with South Africa, Palestine, the United States, South America, it's very, very important in this particular climate of reducing arts funding that we keep administration alone to a minimum. If we now have to start looking at increasing our admin and reducing our artistic output, which isn't just about concerts, not just about theatre, it's about the outreach work, it's about the community work that we do, then we're going to be an impoverished nation, in my view.
Exactly.
In Duncan Smith, do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, I don't think that would happen at all. You know, the honest truth is that what we're saying here is more balance across the board, outside and inside. And with respect, you also named the work that you do with countries outside of the European Union. Exactly. Art transcends boundaries and barriers. Of course, John is right that the European culture, but they're all very different. We're all very proud of them. We want them to exist, but also the culture from other countries as well. So the point I'd simply make is, art is beyond the European Union. It's not just because of the European Union. It is because of the great skills and talents of the people that lived in different countries through different reasons, produced the great works of art, whether it be plays, whether it be paintings, whether it be
But
poetry.
the questioner
It doesn't
is right.
need the European Union to get art or culture going.
But
It needs us to make sure we
questioner
recommend our
is
own
right
culture.
that at the moment you have to have visas and such like for people outside the European Union. If we left the European Union, all those restrictions would come, and so it would mean
Well, they don't
that
come
instead,
on, where this lady comes
instead of
from.
having a
Yeah.
large area where you don't have those problems, that problem would come right home, and that would be a great pity, and it would be a sad step backwards
That's just
to
a
the
scare
old days
story,
in
isn't
which
it?
we used
It's
to
not
fight
true.
each other. This is not a sensible thing.
So
Let's keep
culture
it
doesn't
open
exist in
and let
Australia, culture
European
doesn't exist
work
in New
here
Zealand,
and us
culture
work
doesn't
in the rest
exist in
of Europe.
America
I'm
because
going to move
apparently
on.
they have
I'm going to
controlled
move on
borders.
to question number 4, which I think actually sums up everything that's been going on here this evening. David Clark.
Good evening. I'm absolutely convinced this is not going to help a poor demolition contractor in any way whatsoever. Does either side know with certainty that they are right? they are both stating facts which seem to be totally contradictory.
Well, I think...
So how on earth can any of us believe whatever you're saying, particularly when you keep talking over each other as well? But that's just an aside.
You have to look at the evidence, and I think the evidence, as I said earlier, is that North America has been much more successful than the South because of democracy. West Germany was much more successful than East because of democracy, although it's now being reduced. Japan was in a terrible state compared to now when it's the second richest country in the world, or most successful country in the world, as a result of democracy. And fantastic stories from all around the world, South Korea versus North. So the evidence that you do have is that if there is democracy, people get a chance to thrive, and it's linked to prosperity and freedom. So that's the evidence. The EU is an unusual organisation, a supranational organisation, heading off in a direction, and no one knows where that's going to end. It's very doubtful, as you've seen in Greece and Portugal, for example, if it can really produce prosperity.
That is something I want to bring up, because there are actually, we talk about the risks of the unknown of leaving, but there are also unknowns and risks about staying in, aren't there, Jonathan?
Well, I was going to say, to answer the question and follow on from Tim, we don't know for certain. Yeah, I mean, people come up with these forecasts. No one knows for certain what will happen. I can only speak from my business and the sector I am, and I know we will suffer, life will be worse for us. But there's always an emotional element to this argument. And my emotional reason is I am a passionate believer in freedom and democracy. And the most important thing that's happened in my lifetime, to me, is the fall of the Berlin Wall and what has happened in Eastern Europe. I spent a year in 1992 in Central Europe, in Hungary, helping businesses get ready for the free market. And at that time, the practical support provided by the EU and the attraction of joining the EU was incredibly important in bringing those countries to the West, to a Western democracy. I still feel, and it's an emotional feeling I'll accept, that the EU is a strong bulwark against anti-democratic tendencies, and that's why the only people that internationally seem to support us leaving the EU are Vladimir Putin and some of his friends like Marine Le Pen. So there is an emotional element, it's not all rational, and I think it is very much about freedom.
Ian Duncan-Smith, I'm sure you would agree there is an emotional element to this. I mean, this is something you feel passionately about and have done for many years. But it is difficult for voters to get a grip, because there aren't that many real facts, are there?
Well, there are lots of competing facts, and so I apologise at the end of the day if people out there are subsumed in a whole set of facts they can't make head nor tail of. That's, I'm afraid, going to be the nature of a lot of this debate. But I think that there are a couple of critical points. The first is that, what is the balance of risk? At the moment, the Remain side say that it's all right because we know where we are, we know where we stand with the European Union, but we'd have no idea what will happen outside. Let me just say that there are huge risks for staying in the European Union. You are now being locked. I mean, once we make this vote, that's it. Forever you are locked to an organisation which has a migration crisis going on, which will only get worse. Even from a terrorist standpoint, we have no idea half of the people that are coming in and what we do about them and the chaos that's ensued, and the European Union has failed completely to sort that out. We have a euro crisis which goes on destroying economies across the European Union. I mean, honestly, in Greece right now, I was talking to a Greek lady the other day who's come to get British citizenship, and she said, in my country now, it's like being in the third world. People in Greece can't even get health treatment. It's so hard and harsh has the European Union and the IMF been on the Greeks over their debt bailouts that it's almost impossible for them to rise from that. Seems to me that is a terrible affair and changing of governments. So there are huge risks, that plus the open borders. And I simply say that this is a balance of those risks. But I will say one...
What is the nub of it for you personally? What do you think is the most
I think it comes down to one very simple fact, which is, as I said earlier, against the risks of remaining, and yes, there will be risks in leaving. There's no balance of no risk. My point is the difference is this, one single fact, that if we vote to leave, we make the decisions about what is best for the UK rather than giving that decision-making process to an extra 27 nations who, if we don't agree with them, and we actually don't want to do some of these things, we actually have to tug along at the back because we were outvoted under the system. So in other words, the point that was being made about democracy is true. I want an elected government in Britain to be friends with Europe, to trade and cooperate with our friends in Europe, as we always have been. The EU is not Europe. We're not leaving Europe, we're leaving the EU. And the difference will be, instead of carping and moaning and complaining, we'll actually have a decent relationship which is based on friendship, trust, cooperation, and shared interests such as defence. That is fine by me, but we will make the decisions against the unknowns that come through, and we will work to cooperate with others where it's necessary, but we will make those decisions, and you will decide which government it is that actually makes those decisions for you. It is.
It is 7:30, so I've let Mr. Duncan Smith give his kind of closing statements, as it were, because he has to exit very quickly to go and do a vote in the Commons. Thank you very much, Mr. Duncan Smith. Yes, Lord Deeble, I want to talk to you about that question about the stating facts, because there has been quite a lot of conflicting arguments here tonight and generally in the campaign.
Well, I wanted to answer the question directly. I mean, I don't think anybody thinking about the future should say, I know that I'm right. So what do we normally do when we're trying to look at a decision like this? First of all, we have to see, what do other people who might know about it think? Now, every major friend, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Barack Obama, all the other countries of Europe, our friends, all say, we want you to stay in the European Union. Second thing is, I say, well, what about the economics? Let me ask what the assessments are. Well, the Treasury's assessment is clear. The International Monetary Fund's assessment is clear. The OECD assessment is clear. All the expert assessments. Now, you can say, I don't like experts.
They might be coming from a certain standpoint.
Well, they might be. But the question is, there's no reason why they should. They have objectively looked at this, and they have said it. So the problem is this. The Treasury,
for example, the Treasury's assessments are based on them estimating that the economy will shrink if we leave.
Yeah,
and other economists say that wouldn't happen.
Yeah, but when you say other commentators, the truth is no other official commentator for other countries, in international organisations, none of these people do other than say, this will be for our economic harm. Now, the question was, do I know I'm right? No, I'm not saying that, because any politician who says that deserves to be booed, because you can't say you know you're right. What you have to say is, in a world in which all our friends want us to stay, in a world in which all the international organisations and national organisations tell us that we would be poorer off, in a world in which the key people concerned with security tell us, for goodness sake, stay in, because this is the best way to combat terrorism, in that world, although I can't say I know I'm right, I would have to be very, very self-opinionated if I said all those people are wrong, and I know that the alternative is safer. Nobody should say that without trying to explain to me why all the bodies and all our friends say stay in. And the only people who want us to go out, well, there are three: Mr. Trump, Mr. Putin, and Marine Le Pen. And that really would frighten me. The people who want you to go out are that lot.
I just want to go to a supplementary question from Luke Morris about the nature of the campaign, because as we've found tonight, it's not only contradictory, but there are some feelings that it's been quite negative. Where are you, Luke?
I'm here. Good evening. We saw in the Scottish referendum how a very negative campaign may have won the day, but was toxic for the establishment parties. My question really is, after a pretty negative campaign so far, how will things look in the UK on the 24th of June?
Tim Martin.
It's a very good question, because John has said that he doesn't want to talk about, he doesn't say any politician which is certain about the future deserves respect. But of course, Osborne and Cameron have both been very certain about the future, because they've said that today it will lead to, genocide and war. That sounds very...
I don't think they said it absolutely would lead to that, did they?
It would result in, well, what they did say, and this is in the Treasury report which John mentioned, is that over 15 years it would lead to 0.5% per annum lower growth. Not no growth, but lower growth if we left. And I don't think many people realise, certainly I was unsure about it if you're not a politician, that the head of the Treasury is George Osborne. So he's produced this report himself, which has forecasts that will be many thousands of pounds worth of 15 years in the future. So that's quite certain, isn't it? Would
I
you
think
say?
the civil service probably had something to do with it. Can I
Can
just make a point, though, Tim, that there has been negativity on both sides. I mean, I heard Michael Gove yesterday saying that the EU wanted to take over our taxation system.
Can I reply to the question here, which is that what's the impact of negative campaigning? And I think the negative campaigning is a particular style that's grown up in the last 20 years. In Scotland, it was exemplified with businessmen, the CBI, other people trotted out to say how terrible it would be if the Scots were independent. That leaves a very bad taste. So if, as a result of negative campaigning, particularly, I think, by the government, if, as a result of that, people vote to stay and feel they've been cheated, as I think some people in Scotland feel, it's a very bad basis for the future, not just of politicians, but for the country.
Jonathan Knight.
Sorry, as Tim talks, I just love the image of George Osborne sitting there late at night in the Treasury with his burger.
Yeah, he's the boss, like you're the boss and I'm the boss. And if we want our accountants to produce some numbers, they will. They're like that. No
So going back to the question, yes, I think it has often been a negative campaign. You know, people say that the Remain campaign is Project Fear. I would call the other side Project Hate. You know, particularly when
that's an insult
racial
and a
slurs
libel.
on the American
I
president.
don't hate anyone.
But I would
if he
point
says
out,
hate.
with due respect to the Prime Minister, I'm not necessarily always his greatest fan, but he said he's standing down at the next election. From a Conservative Party perspective, he could very easily have gone for Brexit. It wouldn't have been difficult to bring the majority of his party with him on that. But he took the view that clearly that was the best thing for this country is to stay in. And so, you know, we can make fun of his motives and some of the other people on the Remain side. But, you know, he's obviously taken a very objective view as to that's the best thing for this
Lord
country.
Bevan, why have they been scaremongering in the way they have about the dangers of leaving, rather than just looking straightforwardly at the
I think that the question was about negative campaigning on both sides, and it does seem to me that it has been far too negative for things. So let me say why I really believe in this. I was taken to the railway station at the age of 18 by my father on my first travel abroad, and I chose where I went. And on our way, he said, "You are the first generation at 18 who chooses where you want to go. Every previous generation has gone to war." And when I took my son, who's now the Member of Parliament for Ipswich, to his first visit abroad, I said to him, "This is the second generation." Now, I just remind you what my friend said about what was happening in the European Union. What happened was that NATO defended us against the East. But what the European Union has done is to give a place to these countries so that they have become democratic and they work within the democratic arrangements. So one may attack the Commission, but it is the Council of democratically elected ministers that make the decision. Can I just say, I'm not being negative about this. I believe that being in Europe enables Britain to play its real part in the world, that we are listened to in the European Union and outside because of what we do there. And I don't want to go back to the old days in which we cannot work and live together and find ways out round a table of our problems. Instead of saying, we know best, we will do everything ourselves, and you can get on with it. I'm proud to be part of an association which together is able to lead the world in the environment, to lead the world in a whole range of things about trade. We can go on doing that if we're in the European
Lord
Union.
Deacon.
And that's not negative, that's a positive belief.
We go back If we go back to Luke's question, Lord Deben, what do you think it will look like the day after the referendum, regardless, especially in your party, which has been shown to be very divided?
Well, I think it's very different as to what the result is. If we have voted to leave the European Union, the whole of our nation will be concerned with trying to organise what that means. And I don't think we'll have much time for anything except a great deal of quarrelling. And then, of course, having come to some agreement with the European Union, let's imagine we can do that, Parliament is then going to have to vote whether that is a satisfactory agreement or not. So I don't think, if we say to go out, then this is going to be a very tough time for everybody. If we stay in, I believe that the Conservative government and the Conservative Party has actually got, for the first time, to say, OK, we are now in, we're going to make it work all together, and we're not going to go on trying to undermine it at every point, which is what's happened in the past.
Isn't that optimistic, given that it's been like that for a long time?
Well, I'm hoping for a real change.
Luke Morris, would you like to come back and just have a final say on what you've heard?
I think it's pretty destructive to play on people's fears. Yeah. I think most businesses deal with uncertainty every day. So I think that often the cases and the scaremongering doesn't really carry much truck, and is probably quite a damaging thing for most businesses. I mean, if you think about, a year ago, Jeremy Corbyn or Leicester City or Donald Trump, nobody would have been able to predict all that stuff. My personal view is we're stronger if we're able to have direct contact with people who were democratically elected. So.
Martin, you want to say something very quickly?
Yes, the point that John said, he said he's not scaremonger, he doesn't approve of it, but then mentions everyone going off to war, and the implication of that is that it might happen again. But the protection against war is surely democracy. And we have, in my personal opinion, zero danger against our old foes, France and Germany. I'd be quite happy to fully, it's an important point this, fully disarm, because they're democracies, and I'm worried about it being reduced. Because they're democracies, I don't think we've got any danger from them. Just as a democracy, we will not invade them. The danger comes from autocracy, and the movement of Europe is towards greater autocracy. And I think for the future of humanity, never mind Europe, that you have to make sure that in the future democracy is entrenched in North Korea, in Russia.
I'm going to let you sum up in just a moment, because what I'm going to do now is I think a lot of people will end up voting on their gut instinct, won't they? We talked about passion before. We've heard a lot of issues discussed this evening, but what I want to do is ask each one of you, just in 20 to 30 seconds, and I mean that, 20 to 30 seconds, you'll get a wind-up, to just say what you think, as I asked Ian Duncan Smith, what the nub of the issue is. If there's one thing that this audience takes away, what should it be? Tim Martin, you go first.
Well, I've already said that democracy, prosperity and freedom are interlinked, but I would say the big important issue coming up is I'm personally liberal and don't feel that we should issue I think that migrants from France and Italy and so on should still be able to come to this country. That's my personal view. It will be decided by Parliament. Are you willing for 88 million Macedonians, Turks and Albanians, for that decision for them to be allowed to live in the UK decided by people we haven't elected in Europe?
Okay. Jonathan Knight.
Of course. It's tough because Tim's just thrown in a curveball about Turkey, which is a load of rubbish.
We're not going to just. I want your nub of the issue.
So my nub. We live in a highly interconnected world. Things, technology and globalization is changing the world we live in at a pace that no politician can really cope with, and certainly not civil servants. Whether you like it or not, pulling out of the EU is severing ties with our nearest market, and I say it as part of being in a global market, and us as a business, we're in a global market, and the EU is an important part of it. Staying in the EU does bring some certainty. The uncertainty if we leave will be massive for businesses in the next 10 years. And for all growing businesses and where the growth in this country is going to come from, we can't afford that.
We heard Ian Duncan Smith's nub of it. He feels very strongly that we should be courageous and take this leap, and that it's not going to be anywhere near as bad as painted by the Remain camp. What is your nub of the issue?
Well, I just want to say every single one of the 28 nations would have to vote in favour of Macedonia or Greece or Turkey joining. I'm just saying as a matter of fact. So that is not the issue.
Well, do not think they might vote.
It's only fair. It's only fair to say the fact.
No.
It's only as a matter of fact. As far as my belief is, it's simply
You're
this.
not in control.
We live in a very dangerous world, and we live in a world in which we have to learn to live with the rest of the world. The great thing about the European Union is that we are gradually learning to live with our nearest neighbours. And if you suddenly say, we're not prepared to be with you in this association, you say two things. One is, we're not going to have the influence in the world that we used to have, that we're not going to be able to help the rest of the world to the very democracy that is being asked for. And you're also saying we're going to find it even more difficult to work with countries which are very much more different from us. All those countries we've got to work with. So I say I want to stay in because this is the way in which we'll learn to live in a world where cooperation is going to be the only way to stop destruction.
Well, I'm not sure that any of those were under 30 seconds, but thank you very much. And that is all we have time for this evening. And I hope you have found the debate illuminating as well as quite noisy. Thanks again to the people who've worked so hard to put this event on. That's the Ipswich Suffolk Business Club, the Suffolk IOD, the East Anglian Society of Chartered Accountants, and to our sponsors, Goatley Solicitors and Dance East, for providing the venue. Thank you all for coming and for submitting your questions. But most importantly, thank you very much to our eminent panel who've given up their valuable time to come here and help us make a decision on this hugely important issue. A final round of applause, please, for Lord Deben, Jonathan Wright, Tim Martin, and Ina Spencer, and Dr. Smith.